Welcome back. My name is Dr. Gina Zappia. I am the Research Program Manager at AHURI, and I am facilitating our final panel session of the day, Urban Transport Options During a Pandemic. In this session, we will discuss how the way people move about the city on a day-to-day basis has changed, and perhaps permanently since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. In particular, we will touch on how we predict and cater for changing urban transport needs into the future. Again, we will be accepting questions throughout the session via the Q&A portal, and I will pose as many as possible to our panel later on. And with that, I am pleased to welcome our panel of speakers. The session will begin with a research presentation from Professor Jago Dodson of RMIT University and the lead author of the AHURI project, Innovative Responses to Urban Transportation, Current Practice in Australian Cities. Professor Dodson was appointed Professor of Urban Policy and Director of the Centre for Urban Research at RMIT University in 2014. With a wide interest in theoretical and applied urban questions, Professor Jago Dodson has an extensive record of research into housing, transport, urban planning, infrastructure, energy, and urban governance problems. This project is live on the AHURI website and available now, along with the policy evidence summary and executive summary in the handout section. We will then hear from Frankie Carroll, CEO of the Suburban Rail Loop Authority. With 30 years' experience in both private and public sectors, Frankie is a highly experienced and respected senior executive. Frankie joined the Suburban Rail Loop Authority from the Queensland Public Service, where he served as Under-Treasurer, leading the Queensland Treasury. We also welcome our panellists. Please join me in welcoming Kate Meyrick, Director of Urbis. Kate is a respected urbanist with more than 30 years of international experience, which has seen her contribute to the positioning and place experience strategy for major regeneration and transport city shaping projects in 17 cities across 4 continents. Please feel free to read more in-depth biographies on all our speakers today at the conference website. And with that, I would like to invite Professor Dodson to present his research.
Great, thank you, Gina, and thanks to AHURI for inviting me along to present today. Slightly odd time to be delivering this research because we completed the final report about a year ago. We had hoped to launch it earlier this year, but various kinds of disruption have prevented us from doing so. But perhaps now we're coming out of lockdown, and with the easing of restrictions in Victoria today, we might feel a bit freer to think about the future and what it might hold, including for our cities and our transport systems. So this project is looking at innovative responses to urban transportation and focusing on what was current practice in Australian cities when the report was commissioned in 2019. It's all available on the AHURI website, as Gina's already mentioned. I've even taken the innovative step of adding a QR code there, which you might be able to zap with your phone. Now we're all used to using that innovative way of accessing information. I'd like to also acknowledge my collaborators on this project, Kerry Curtis, David Ashmore, Ian Woodcock, and Stephen Kovacs. So just a brief overview of the presentation. I'll talk shortly about the project aims and objectives, how we conceptualised the project and approached it, a bit of a review of innovation theory, a review of policy in Australian jurisdictions that we undertook, a review of innovation practice, and then some conclusions and policy development. This project isn't specifically examining the impact of COVID on Australian cities or our transport systems or even on innovation, but I think some of the conclusions that I'll offer towards the end signal some directions that Australian transport policy and institutions and cities generally could think about as we come into the or develop momentum during the recovery phase of the COVID experience. So the objectives of this project were to ask how technological and other forms of change are affecting transport systems in Australian cities, what strategic approaches are metropolitan transport programs and policies adopting in response to these changes, how do these responses compare to international examples, and what forward positions should Australian transport policies at the metropolitan scale consider in response to some of these major transport system changes. To conceptualise the study, we had four sort of main components. One is looking at drivers of innovation. What are the social, economic and environmental factors motivating and enabling innovation? We were looking at the domains of innovation, so the sectors, particular technologies that may be being introduced as part of innovation processes. We then looked at the international context and used that to inform investigation of Australian cases, and then finally looked at some potential future responses that Australia and Australian jurisdictions could implement to respond to innovations as they occur, or more so to facilitate and support innovations to happen. So just briefly to further summarise this, some of the drivers of innovation we looked at were obviously advances in technology, gaps in regulation, changes in market demand, fiscal issues, infrastructure, financing and availability, environmental imperatives, travel demand, and other kinds of factors relating to urban form and structure. And the technologies, the domains we were looking at, some of those were technology orientated, like disruptive technologies such as mobility as a service, ride-hailing apps, micro-mobilities, autonomous vehicles, attempts to shape and influence travel behaviour in terms of reducing car dependency, addressing public transport issues, encouraging telecommuting, which there was policy around this pre-COVID, but as we're seeing from the way this conference today is being handled, telecommunication has become rather a norm and became innovative very quickly. We also looked at urban structure issues like activity centres, improving public transport on the fringe, some climate change and pricing issues around electric vehicles, road pricing, parking pricing, and then some infrastructure procurement questions around funding and financing projects and services. There's a long, extensive review in the report on international examples, which I won't go into too much detail today, but if you want a fairly contemporary literature review on international experience against these domains, you're welcome to look into the report. I'll go into a bit of detail on the policies in Australia in a moment, and then thinking through potential bundles of policies. And then in terms of future responses, raising the questions of what might be an innovation framework for Australian urban transport policy, how to build collaborative cross-sectoral responses, and what kinds of new research agendas and directions might be relevant to those. So just a little bit of background on innovation theory. There's a couple of slides on this. In this project, we're looking at innovation in terms of the conception and application of new technical, social, organisational, institutional or economic practices that respond to societal demands or needs. So we're taking a framing in the project that wasn't solely focused on innovation as being a technological advancement kind of concern. It's around a wider set of institutional responses to societal demands or needs, and using this notion of drivers of innovation to understand the social, economic, environmental, institutional conditions that generate market and wider, including policy demand for innovation, and the dynamic relationship between this demand and the kind of wider context and suppliers of innovation, whether those are market firms producing technological responses or wider suppliers of innovation in an institutional sense. A large part of the project looked at innovation models internationally and theories of innovation. So I thought I'd just briefly talk about some of these. Earlier notions of innovation and probably some of the more fundamental basic notions in the literature on innovation focus on product development. These tend to be fairly linear ideas about innovation, in which research and development leads to a new product, and that product is then introduced into the marketplace and adopted or not adopted, depending on the market acceptance or absorption of that innovation. That's a fairly product-orientated approach. technology-driven approach, and fairly linear. And it's probably a dated approach in the contemporary literature. There's a second sort of literature on innovation that focuses on technological innovation systems in two dimensions. One, institutional, of how one creates or how ecosystems of technological innovation emerge through institutional relationships between firms, policymakers, market actors, and so forth, that then facilitate and enable innovation to occur through various kinds of knowledge spillover. But there's also a spatial dimension to this that examines how innovations occur in particular place-based contexts, such as perhaps the classic example would be a Silicon Valley, where you get innovation through institutional processes that emerge within a particular spatial locality. We also investigated or reviewed ideas of socio-technical transition, which are probably more about how innovations occur in social and technological processes, and then how these are adopted and disseminated at the societal or economy scale. This tends to be more focused on historical kind of transitions in technology and social practice, such as, for example, classic studies looking at the change from the horse and cart to the automobile. But these questions of socio-technical transition and transition studies are still very influential in contemporary innovation theory. And then a final kind of literature we looked at was public sector innovation theories, which are starting to take greater prominence as dissatisfaction with some of those earlier models of innovation, such as sort of linear product development or even technological innovation systems that are starting to be addressed, whereby the public sector can be seen to enable and lead innovation through, for example, policies and regulations such as environmental performance standards that put a floor on the environmental performance of particular technologies or particular policy settings, and therefore raise the requirements on suppliers to improve performance. There's a lot of debate about that going on at the moment in the case of electric vehicles as to whether we should have fuel economy standards or targets in terms of electric vehicle uptake. There's also mission-led innovation, where grand societal challenges are identified and agreed upon by actors across multiple sectors, and then each actor kind of aligns their operations and their institutional settings to support and enable the achievement of those grand objectives. There's also an emerging literature on innovation bureaucracies, whereby public sector actors that may have traditionally been organised in on a bureaucratic model, institutional model, sort of redesign themselves to become innovation focused. And you might imagine a traditional Department of Transport in the transport context as historically having been organised on bureaucratic lines, potentially being reorganised to focus on enabling and supporting innovation in both policy and technology. And then finally, there's the notion of living labs, which tend to be fairly place-based innovation sort of hubs, where multiple actors across government, private sector, NGOs, the community, and so forth come together and establish kind of place-based objectives for innovation, and whether it's transport systems or other kinds of areas of shared interest, such as sustainability. Often living labs are organised around sustainability objectives. So these are some innovation kind of theories that we dipped into. They probably informed more the latter stages of the project when we look at the Australian transport institutions in terms of their innovation capacity. But keep these in mind as we're thinking through some of the policy discussion that's up next. And just to kind of illustrate what we're talking about when we talk about innovation systems, this is from one of the research papers we reviewed in the project. This is the European Automobile Innovation System, and it demonstrates how, in terms of the automobile sector, there are multiple actors across market actors and government actors in terms of markets and regulation that stimulate demand for particular services or technologies. There are a whole raft of frameworks, such as taxation incentives and so forth. The political system has a role in terms of government settings, national government roles, policies, governance, including in automobiles, climate and environmental policy. There's the education and research system around training, research, public sector contributions to that. There's the innovation infrastructure around standards, subsidies, intellectual property, but also finance and venture capital. And then in the case of automobiles, and this is probably a gap if you look at, say, automobile innovation in Australia, we don't have at the moment an industrial system around automobile production, but in Europe, US, other economies that do produce automobiles, there's an industrial system of producers, knowledge networks between them, and a whole raft of niche companies that are suppliers of various sorts. So if you put all this all together, you can conceive an automobile production system as an innovation system, and each element in this system has a role to play in terms of facilitating innovation. Now, this probably doesn't have immediate relevance to Australia because we don't manufacture cars anymore, but we do manufacture public transport rolling stock like trains, trams, and buses. So one could potentially substitute into this the public transport manufacturing sector in Australia, and you could conceive of it in terms of an ecosystem in relation to all of these wider institutional settings. I've already mentioned the domains of innovation, but just to review these again, as we go into the policy review component, we identified these domains of innovation and then undertook a policy review against all of these, looking at how major policy documents in Australian transport and urban policy address these topics. So for resourcing reasons, we're focused on WA, Victoria, New South Wales, and we took the domains of innovation and the subtopics there, and then looked at key documents in these three jurisdictions, principally metropolitan strategies and transport strategies, as well as some specific strategies, such as in the case of New South Wales, the Connected Autonomous Vehicles Plan and the Electric and Hybrid Vehicle Plan. What this diagram seeks to represent is how across these various policy documents, these different domains and topics in innovation are being addressed. So if you look at, say, transport platforms, mobility as a service, ride-hailing apps, micro-mobilities, autonomous vehicles, for example, in the case of WA, there's relatively little policy attention being dedicated to those. In Victoria, there is some attention to mobility as a service and ride-hailing apps, less so in terms of movement in place. In New South Wales, mobility as a service is being addressed by the Future Transport Strategy and the Connected Autonomous Vehicles Plan. Ride-hailing appears also in the Victorian Transport Plan, but also in the New South Wales Plan. So you can see across these domains of innovation, the subtopics, where policy attention is being dedicated to these issues. I won't go into too much detail about this because it's obviously a lot that could be discussed. I think something to highlight there is the road pricing and parking pricing under climate change and pricing. Those perhaps are highlighted in this diagram as not getting a great deal of attention within those policy documents. So potential areas of oversight in terms of innovations in transport policy. We've also gone through and done a more detailed and more qualitative policy evaluation in relation to each of those domains, those broad domains of innovation, then looking at the specific subtopics along the top there, and some qualitative criteria in relation to those in terms of a whole raft of issues such as ability to operationalize, scalability, potential for greater innovation, access and inclusion, and so forth. And then made some qualitative assessments as to whether each of those is given a high level of attention or a relatively low level of attention in terms of those qualitative criteria. As you can see, across the different policy documents, there are different areas of emphasis. Some areas such as these ability to operationalize, scalability, and so forth, getting perhaps more of those high levels of attention. Further down the diagram, and you can see this is common to each of the domains, the potential for disruption of private car ownership and use gets a lot less attention, and potential impact there. Something that I'll talk about a bit later in the conclusions. I realise I'm probably starting to run a bit short of time, so I'll just maybe skip over these policy evaluation discussions. There's more detail in the final report if you'd like to look through that. But I guess just on a very brief skim, you can see there's different degrees of attention being given to these kind of issues within the policy sphere at this point in time. Again, in the case of urban structure, activity centres and improving public transport on the fringe, some attention, not much disruption happening to automobility. The same goes for electric vehicles and road pricing, and also infrastructure procurement. So noting time is running short, overall the findings we present in the report are that although there are some innovations being encouraged and supported, the policy is largely pursuing late 20th century, early 21st century models of land and transport planning. Governance barriers and transport and land use integration persist. Governance to optimise new mobility technologies is relatively weak. I'm starting to get some feedback. Being wound up. What's happening there? Funding and financing for innovation is patchy. There are federal and state tensions apparent, such as in electric vehicle policy, something we've seen since the report was completed as well. I think one of the big findings is that the car remains firmly entrenched as a legacy technology and is very resistant to even innovations that are seen as being disruptive. We also then, following that policy review, looked at how Australia's transport sort of policy system is geared to innovation more generally, and did a bit of a review of some major sort of policy settings and policy documents. One thing we tend to find, whether it's at the federal level or the state level, innovation tends to be framed as private sector led within competitive markets. So it's up to the private sector to innovate, and innovations come into the marketplace within a competitive environment, and they succeed or fail based on market interest. Sort of, we call it an emerge, adopt, and regulate kind of sequence. There's relatively limited understanding of innovation theory or international practice around innovation within Australian transport institutions. There's very little framing of innovation for social and environmental goals. It tends to be focused on technology for transport efficiency generally. We did a brief review of some key national institutions that one would expect to have an innovation frame, such as the Transport and Infrastructure Council and the National Transport Commission. Although they mention innovation at various points in some of their policy statements, there's almost no effort to craft an innovation system around some of that, those theoretical approaches that I mentioned earlier, those models of innovation. We also have a research and development system that's not clearly orientated to innovation. For example, the CRC scheme, of which there are a number of transport-orientated CRCs, those that we looked at had very little understanding of innovation as an innovation ecosystem, or as a mission-led kind of orientation and so forth. So in summary, the Australian transport sector is quite poorly positioned to support and enable innovation at this point in time. Something we might think about coming out of COVID. In terms of our recommendations, we set out the view that we think we need national goals in transport innovation tied to major economic, social, and environmental challenges. And I think we're in a really backward position at the moment. If we look at the future fuels strategy that came out just recently, the discussion about electric vehicles, I mean, it is quite dire how retrograde the national conversation is around innovation in those spheres, and just the almost deliberate reluctance on the part of the federal government to take any kind of leadership in this space. In response, we need some cross-sectoral, multilateral, multi-scale institutional building that links together national and state and even local government bodies, and not just within government, but across the private and NGO sector as well. We need to seriously look at our public agencies in terms of how they're geared for innovation, facilitating innovation ecosystems within transport. And we need to do a lot of learning from international examples and models, particularly the European Union, which has really pushed forward on innovation, particularly around major global and societal challenges like environmental innovation. But it does require the state to be active in innovation. I think certainly at the federal level at this point in time, we've almost got a deliberately inactive national state that's almost trying to run the other way if we look at energy policy in terms of avoiding and suppressing innovation in favour of legacy technologies. We also need a lot more research on innovation systems and policy in Australia. There's not very many studies like this one that have been undertaken into innovation systems in transport or the urban sector generally. I'll leave it there. There's some more detail on the report if you'd like to access it. Grab your phone and zap that QR code or click on that link. And I will leave it there and try and get back to the main screen.
Thank you so much, Jago, for that insightful review of your research and the wealth of data that's contained within that literature review and policy review. It's a really fabulous report. So now it's my pleasure to turn to Frankie Carroll to present the Suburban Rail Loop Authority.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you to the Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute for hosting this event today. Before I begin, I would like to respectfully acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are all on today, paying my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. The Suburban Rail Loop is a rare opportunity to plan how city grows based on Plan Melbourne's core objectives of connectivity, livability, and productivity. It's become evident from the pandemic that our future way of travel and work will change. And in Melbourne, we're already planning for that future. The Suburban Rail Loop is a city-shaping project that will transform not only the way we move around, but how we live and the way we grow. Here's a short video to describe the project.
Suburban Rail Loop will deliver faster and more convenient travel for all Victorians, connecting major health, education and employment areas and the airport. Over time, Suburban Rail Loop will reshape Melbourne by developing a city of centres linked to Victoria. That's because Suburban Rail Loop is more than a transport project. It delivers urban planning and investment around the stations. New and improved cycling and walking paths and public space, and thousands of new business and job opportunities a short walk from a station, helping to shape where people live and work as our city and state grow. Cheltenham to Box Hill will be operating by 2035. Box Hill to the airport will create more jobs and encourage more people onto public transport. With modern trains and turn-up and go services, it will slash travel times and ease congestion, providing a huge boost to our economy. With construction underway next year.
The current train network reflects how we travelled before the pandemic, where the CBD was the core of activity. But this may not reflect how we want to travel. The current train network is all hub and spokes with no wheel. SRL will become the wheel, creating new ways to travel in the future. The pandemic has encouraged us to explore our local communities. Before we got our coffee closer to our work, now we've discovered the coffee closer to our home. The reality was already recognised in Plan Melbourne, changing from a monocentric structure to a city of centres. This has presented us with huge opportunity to reshape our city and plan for the future. SRL provides the infrastructure and platform to reshape our local communities for that future. Without SRL and a plan how we grow as a community, we become a less attractive place to do business and will lose the huge economic and productivity opportunities that come with growth. Plan Melbourne set out a vision for Melbourne to be a global city and the creation of neighbourhoods to deliver greater opportunity and choice. It is also recognised that realising this vision requires more than just reacting to waves of demand. It requires planning ahead to shape where and how we address this demand. By facilitating more diverse housing choices and improved access to services, amenity and population serving infrastructure, SRL will encourage investment, creating a better way to living locally within our communities. Delivering on Plan Melbourne's vision, it will help us transition from our current city structure around a single CBD to a city of centres. Over decades, SRL will slowly and sustainably reshape the city of our future. This project will reshape the city by influencing where and how people live, work, shop, play and travel. Living closer to where we work and creating communities of that future. As you can see from Victoria's network in the hub and spoke, there's no wheel. SRL will become that wheel. If you look around the world at other global cities, Paris, London, New York, Hong Kong, where rail lines orbit and cross the city to get people to where they need to go, it's clear that this is what is missing and this is what is holding us back as a city. Suburban Railway will deliver a 90-kilometre orbital rail line connecting every major metropolitan line from the Frankston to Urbis lines via the airport. Convenient interchanges across the existing rail lines linking to regional Victoria, giving people much better access to growing employment, health and education centres in our middle suburbs. It is clear COVID has promised us a huge shift in our thinking about where we work and how we live and how our city grows. We know many people now want to spend more time in their local communities and work closer to home. The Suburban Railway will help us to achieve this. Better transport connections, more housing choices, all within a 20-minute walk. This is what makes Suburban Railway different. Careful planning, investment and greater urban design will create a city of centres over time. 1.6 kilometre precincts around each stations that will be home to more than 500,000 people by 2056, with nearly 50,000 new households. And when we build these new homes, there will be a focus on a more diverse and affordable and social housing suitable for families. We're building safe, inviting spaces with lots of cycling and walking tracks, generating huge environmental benefits. The 20-minute neighbourhoods across Melbourne will be vibrant, attractive and well-connected communities with everything people need within a short walk or cycle. SRL isn't just a train line in the suburbs that gets people from A to B. As you know, with strategic infrastructure is integrated with target land use planning and precinct development is the power to unlock the economic potential of a city. Together with greater transport connections delivered by the rail line, SRL will attract businesses and households to key precincts over time, slowly reshaping the urban form of Melbourne over decades. We'll see a more diverse mix of housing, more affordable and social housing. Around 50,000 additional households will be living in these areas, closer to jobs, great transport, services, recreation, retail and hospitality. New ways of transport are evolving at a rapid pace. The changing technologies have changed how we use transport modes. More has changed in the last 10 years than the preceding 50 to 100 years. What will tomorrow bring? Construction will begin next year on SRL East from Cheltenham to Box Hill, 26 kilometers of twin tunnels linking 6 new underground stations opening in 2035. And we expect around 70,000 people to use it every day. These will be the stations of the future. Each one will at least have a green 5-star rating. Each one an inviting public space, new focal points in their communities with opportunities for retail and dining and plenty of greenery. The connectivity is crucial. We're building or upgrading 15 kilometers of walking and cycling tracks around SRLE stations. We'll have 70 new or upgraded pedestrian and cycle crossings. And each station will have hundreds of undercover bike spaces, almost 3,500 in total. You can see here for our plans for Cheltenham that SRL East is going to be nothing like we've seen in Australia. We'll be using high-tech custom-built trains that will operate on 100% renewable energy. They'll be fast, efficient, and quiet. This is a once-in-a-generation chance to help change the shape of a city, to incorporate the very best ideas from around the world in urban designs, in transport use, in technology, to deliver a train network and communities that we can be proud of, that will help keep what we love about Melbourne for future generations. Thank you, and I hope you can help us on the journey.
Thank you so much, Frankie. I'd like to ask Kate, what are your initial thoughts on these two presentations?
Wow, so many thoughts. First of all, I thought you were very brave, Frankie, to take on one of the golden rules: never present with animals, children, or live media, multimedia in your presentations. And so a massive thank you for letting me be part of the session. When I grow up, I actually aspire to be a hybrid of Jago and Frankie. So it's a lot to live up to, and you both led really important conversations today. And I think at this time of carbon and climate change, of social and economic disruption, the patterns of how we move around cities and what stations and precincts mean to us are really being radically reinvented on the fly. And sometimes it's difficult to find the space to get together everybody who needs to be there to make sure that the value we're creating for the next 50 years, the next 100 years is really being well thought through. We have a bit of a tendency as an industry and a nation to segment things. You know, this is the transport engineering bit, this is the innovation bit, this is the station design bit, this is the urban realm bit, but actually it's all the same bit. And so my perspective is kind of pretty well known that this is the most important investment we make in the future of our cities. And we know that those cities that perform socially and economically the best are the ones that have the best movement protocols and enable people to use the city in the way they want to use it, however that changes. So movement is so critical to enabling social mobility, spatial equity, productivity, visitor economy. Every single aspect of city life is enabled by movement, and yet we very often don't make the space for the conversation. I think one of the other things that came out of your conversation at the beginning, Jago, was really this idea that every single, and I love this, I think this is so ambitious and yet so blindingly simple. Every single station in our network could be a living lab or a mission-led innovation center. So we could have 100, 200, 300 small innovation-led projects happening in these places to start to connect them into social impact and economic impact and change. And I thought that was a very simple takeaway. And I think a second thing that came from your presentation for me is also the idea that we're moving away from, well, some of us are only just moving into the idea of mobility as a service, but I'm already thinking to the next step that mobility is an experience. And so it isn't just about, do we have functional utilitarian access to movement, but it's, did we enjoy it? Was there something more that happened to us between point A and point B? Did that actually enrich our lives? Was it easy? Did I like it? Would I do it again tomorrow? And the sense that that journey between 2 points actually happens in your hearts and minds before it happens to your body. So do I dread it every day, the walk to the station, the actual train, the walk away from the station to my office? Or is there something about it that inspires and delights me and sets me up for the day or helps me to unwind at the end of the day? So I really like the idea of thinking, how do we use digital technology, not just to increase efficiency, to build productivity, but also to think about art, culture, creativity, experience in a more emotionally intelligent way. So these stations of the future become precincts that are not only living labs, but they're places of empathy as well, that really stand out in the minds of a community as a place they want to be, even if they don't travel. So for those of you who've ever heard me speak before, you know I'm pretty unashamedly the biggest gunzel in town, and I really love stations and I really love trains. So much I'm actually doing a PhD to look at what this transgenerational impact is about. And I've been looking at some data recently generated in every London borough and every local government area in Sydney and in London. And it shows us empirically that since 1980, every location where we have had the planned intersection of land use and transport planning, GRP or gross regional product per resident and per worker has increased at a faster rate and to a greater extent and in a more sustained way than it has on average in that London borough or that local government area. So we can see in data the power that a really well thought through rail, precinct and place outcome actually has. So just a couple of reflections. And they really speak to some of the very encouraging words that you were using there, Frankie, that these projects are not just transport projects. They are projects that shape our city and the way that we're going to live in it for generations that come well after us. And so it's about how good an ancestor are we actually being for the next generation of people who live in these cities. And I look at two London stations. Sometimes I do a presentation, it's my life in stations, but these two matter to me a great deal. And I'm thinking about St Pancras King's Cross on one hand and London Bridge on the other hand. Both very elegant stations in their own different ways, or at least they are now. Both started in a kind of similar context at a similar time. Each of them experiencing intensification and a change in network role as different lines came in and infrastructure was invested in. One took a really strong, coherent, integrated transport and place approach. It was very clear what the purpose the precinct would have in the city, what the proposition needed to be to make that purpose true, and it focused on the place experience. And as a result, it's now one of the most powerful centres of productivity and social impact in London. That's the one that's St Pancras King's Cross. The other one didn't. The other one has an amazing station and an amazing engineering solution that is the envy of the world. And yet it did very little to actually create a more powerful place experience or enhance the productivity of the area, the precinct that immediately surrounded it, which is a real shame because it's basically the doorstep to the City of London. And I could give you another London-based example of the good and the bad. Canary Wharf, Canada Waters, two stations next to each other on the Jubilee Line extension, one in one London borough, one in another. One which came with a really quite well thought through idea of what its purpose was to create a decentralized City of London. The other waiting for market forces to dictate what the solution would be. One is literally 30 light years ahead of the other one, which is only kicking off right now. So it's very interesting to me that the greater the degree of intentionality we put into it, the greater the performance, which perhaps shouldn't be quite such a difficult thing to conceptualize. But again, we tend to disaggregate those two things as if they are being planned independently rather than interdependently. And another point is really about the romance of stations. And I think sometimes we've got to a point where we make the station just a covering for a portal in the ground. And it's not about the adventure, the romance, the magnificence of arriving in a new neighborhood and the sense of adventure that gives you, or alternatively, the sense of belonging because this is your home. And we've lost the ability to connect in civic or in cultural or creative terms. And you can do anything you want with the station. It's a remarkable building. It sets out the values and everything that we believe. All of our civic sensibilities are on display there if we choose them to be. So I look at some of the stations in Poland where they've had significant issues with literacy, and they have quite literally picked up the library and stuck it in the station. So the ticket hall is now where you check out your books and you go through to the platform and you catch a train. That's a very radical and yet quite localized solution. And then I think about Union Station in LA and how they made that a civic concert hall and a place that you go to listen to music and to go to a major civic event as if it was a ceremonial address in the city and not just, again, the place that you get on or get off a train. So I think that it's really important that when we address these new stations that Frankie has carriage of, no pun intended, that we actually think about them in this way. What is the purpose? What ought this station precinct to be? What is the power that it's going to have for 50 to 100 years? How do we understand what that living lab innovation opportunity conveyed or conferred here at this point of time might be, and how do we engage people in that more broadly so that we're using it for a force for good? How do we ensure that all of the opportunities that we have around digital twins and real-time feedback and sensors are actually just what we ordinarily do in these places? They cost a lot of money. Let's understand how to make them perform really highly. And then how do we make sure that they are the front door to a wonderful world of opportunity that inspires and enriches us, and not just a place we move through as rapidly as possible to get somewhere else? You know, there are points in life where you're actually able to bring together efficiency and enrichment very effectively. And I think a station and a station precinct is a really important place in this regard. So I stand back and I look at all the things that have happened in the cities around the world that we love, and I recognize that sometimes bold decisions get announced and people go, seriously? Paris Grand Plan being one example. And then 8 and 10 years later, no one's remembering that. They're remembering what incredible social benefit or economic legacy or what kind of foreign direct investment or event they've been able to attract. And they don't remember how they ridiculed that opportunity when it was first published. So if I was asking anybody to take anything away from today, it's just make sure you listen to people like Jago and Frankie, that you understand their ambition, that we see this as our shared responsibility to leverage the investment of public funds in these places to work as hard as they can for our cities and our communities and make more space for conversations like this.
Thank you very much, Kate. That was such an inspiring response. And I'd like to welcome Jago and Frankie to leap right in and respond to Kate's comments, please.
I'm happy to start. Kate, every station we have is what I call my child, because each of them have a different personality, and it's making sure that personality fits within the community that's actually there. But we actually build a new community for the future as well. So it's about making sure that we get the balance right, because we have to pay homage to the past, as the Pancreas did, but pay homage to the future as well. So it's really, really important that we get this balance right. But I'm building something that's going to be open by 2035. What's it going to look like in 2035 in relation to how the interaction, the first and last mile? So I have huge challenges in front of me.
I am so sorry. We're having a fire evacuation and I don't know if it's real or not. So the loudspeaker is telling me I have to leave the building. Can you just give me one? This has never happened to me before. Can you just give me 1 second to check I'm not going to burn to death, and I'll be right back.
Absolutely. Safety first. Absolutely. Thank you, Frankie. I just wanted to circle back to your research, Jago. You made a point near to the end as you were wrapping up about the lack of national goals in transport innovation, and we need this conversation to move forward. Can you speak more to that comment that you made earlier today?
Yeah, so I think, Australia in many areas of, policy or industrial development tends to try and step back, or tends to have the state step back, and when it comes to technologies, particularly let the private sector lead. But that's not the kind of model that we see in places like Europe, which tend to do this kind of innovation ecosystem kind of work better than what we do. There's a view that if the state steps back, then the genius of the private sector resolves problems. Whereas I'm not sure that's the case in many instances, and particularly when it comes to working out what innovation is for, the state has a really critical role to identify what the social, economic, environmental goals are, and then to shape the way the market operates in order to lead, whether it's private firms in terms of the kind of technologies they produce, towards that shared collective goal rather than just pursuing their own interests. That, however, does require the state to take a position, to have some ambition, to have a vision for society. And I think we have some challenges in Australia at the moment around that. There's a fairly hands-off model. I think, I'm trying to remember the term that was used last week around electric vehicles, letting the can-do private sector rather than having the state leading those kind of ambitions. But it also comes down to how we design our institutions as well, and are the organisations we have that are responsible for policy development, for regulation, all of those sort of more mundane areas of government activity, not just the visioning, are they geared up to this kind of cross-sector, multi-party, multi-domain kind of encouragement and coordination? And I think we're not really giving due attention in the way we design our institutions to those kind of questions. If we take the National Transport Commission, and I should say this is no criticism of the people who work there, if you look at the way that organisation is set up, it's about harmonising regulation across the states and territories. It's about standards and those sort of things. It's not about setting ambitions, setting targets, setting objectives in relation to the national transport system, quite in that sort of innovation, sort of major challenge kind of way. So I think we could do some greater thinking around how we establish our institutions. And just to reflect a little on the kind of the suburban rail loop, which is obviously a really major piece of investment. And I don't want to get into the merits of that from a land use and transport planning point of view. But it's also a major opportunity in terms of innovation thinking, is that it's going to be, what, a $50 billion plus investment over 20 to 30 years. If you took just a tiny fraction of that budget and added an innovation, a deliberate innovation dimension to that project, what possibilities could be imagined to come out of that? Kate's mentioned innovation around the station precincts, but there's a whole, I mean, it's going to be a vast operation over many years, not just around the stations, but around the rolling stock, the track development, the land use coordination around it. You know, there could be an explicit intent to not just deliver the project, but to build an innovation ecosystem around it that enables the performance at the end of it to achieve more for the amount of money that's spent, or even possibly save money along the way. So that's just some thinking that we could possibly entertain in that context.
And of course, sorry, I'm not burning to death, and they're going to come back from me if it turns out to be anything more serious. So sorry about that. But of course, the really interesting thing about what you just said there, Jago, is that doesn't only improve the performance of our transport infrastructure, it also gives us an economic output in terms of something that we can export as a real skill, and it helps us to catch up from our lagger position today to become a leader, in this sector more broadly. So transport tech doesn't appear to be performing as well in Australia as it is in North Europe, which you've already said, and this really does catalyse the opportunity that we've got to build out that capability.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, you could apply that across the whole of the big build program in Victoria overall, which is, haven't counted it up lately, it's probably in the order of about $100 billion being spent over the next 20 or so years. Just having a tiny component of that orientated to innovation in relation to the technologies and the systems and the construction processes and everything that's going on around those projects could potentially enhance the value of what's delivered through those projects. If you bring in other players like the universities, obviously it's a bit self-interested from my point of view, but more of the private sector, community and non-government organisations, I mean, you could actually build a pretty significant innovation ecosystem around big build over a 20-year program and do a lot more interesting things than simply deliver some really big projects.
On that, Jago, that's starting to happen, on the big build itself in relation to my colleagues, BIM, which was, a concept a couple of years ago, is now becoming standard in Victoria. So the idea is with Suburban Rail Loop, and I can talk about that with extent. The Suburban Rail Loop is looking for technologies that are used throughout the world. So we're going to put in automated trains, electric automated trains on renewable energy. So this is new technology coming into Victoria. So it'd be driverless. So this is new to Victoria train systems. But the people I work with are looking at technologies around the world globally and looking for those leading edge changes that are happening. And the challenge that I'll put out to the participants of the conference is, the ideas going forward. As I said, by 2035 we're operational on SRL East, which is about $34.5 billion. Yeah. How will we change the interaction we have in transport and the transport modes we had for that first and last mile? How will technology change it? We've seen that change in the last 10 years. I'm talking another 15, 20 years. What will be the difference? So this is a great chance to actually do this and do this well and get a leading worldwide precincts and development.
I'm curious to know, sorry, just before we were so rudely interrupted, you were talking about the importance of each of your stations reflecting the local community and the local identity. And how do you think we can look beyond the architectural response to do that, so that we're building perhaps, again, the experience and the programmatic response to provide that local flavour and sense of responsiveness?
So, Kate, it's interesting. Each of the station boxes have different attributes, which we'll want to build on. So, for example, we're putting a station box for Deakin University and for Monash University. We're putting a station box in Box Hill. Putting a station box at Clayton. Well, Clayton is a medical centre. So we'll play to the strengths. St. Pancras did some unusual things when they created the station and how they made the precincts really work there. And they did a fantastic job. Technology centers around the world will look at that going, that's how you do these things going forward. You know, each of the station boxes will have their own traits. But if we look at Clayton for just an example, it's health orientated. Well, what about technology and health? How about putting both of them together? How do we make it a place for key workers can actually afford to live going forward? You know, so we have social and economic forces at play. Everybody can have a win in these things and making sure that we get it right. And it's also paying homage to that local community and what it's like. So some of the food shops around the Clayton station, you can't find anywhere else, but they're fantastic. But they're little small food shops. So how do we actually bring those along with us and actually improve for the future generations going forward?
Do you think there's a role for, sorry, I've taken over your job, Gina.
No.
Do you think there's a role also for curators? So one of the things I love about St. Pancras is they have the St. Pancras app. And so I can sit in Brisbane where I'm currently stranded, and I can actually watch everything that's happening at the station and participate in some of the more cultural activities remotely. And I'm really wondering, is there a way in which we can start to understand the SRL as a network or how it intersects with other parts of the network to say, hey, you're on your way home, how about stopping off at Clayton tonight because they've got this amazing public lecture going on, or then you could go to the food van, which is only pulled up outside this station. So is there a way that we can start to build a dialogue to make our infrastructure and the stations that populate it more human, more engaging?
Absolutely. Everything's on the table with this project because the project is so long and it's got a long lead time in relation to the delivery for 2035 and 2043 to 53 for SRL North. It's unusual to have an infrastructure and a precinct project that actually goes over such a long period of time. So it becomes its own body of work and its own life. So the ability to make people interact with that is really, really important. And you know, we'll be looking at those technologies that St. Pancras has used and possibly doing something similar to that or something even better.
Even better is always good.
And so, Jago, I might pose a question directly to you. Which key innovations for urban transport did your research identify, and how relevant are these for the Australian context, do you think?
Sorry, did you say that again, Gina?
Absolutely. So from the research that you've done for the AHURI work, which key innovations for urban transport did the research identify, and how relevant do you think these are for the Australian context?
Well, we sort of had a mix of interventions that we thought were relevant. Obviously, the technology kind of innovations around mobility as a service and ride-sharing apps and autonomous vehicles, though autonomous vehicles aren't actually any really useful level of operation around the world yet. But you know, obviously those have a role to play in the future of that mobility mix. And I think Kate was talking about earlier, you know, the mobility experience, not just the utilitarian aspects of mobility. But another thing we sort of grappled a bit with this question of local things that would be innovative if they were brought to Australia, and therefore innovative in the Australian context because we're not doing them, versus already operating overseas and therefore not particularly new in overseas context. And I think that's an area where Australia could probably think a bit harder in terms of things that are routine elsewhere that we haven't really done particularly well. If you think about things like land use and transport integration, we haven't done that particularly well. I mean, one of my critiques of the suburban rail loop, for example, is that it's in essence spending $50 billion to solve the fact that we haven't been able to coordinate our suburban land uses over a 40-year period since the district centres plan was released in 1981. So, you know, actually putting into place good policy would be innovative in Australia if we actually did it. And then obviously these wider innovation system kind of thinking approaches as to how we actually enhance, you know, how we innovate in terms of innovation. So those are just some thoughts there.
Frankie, would you like to respond?
Well, I can see Jago's a fan because if we could plan it earlier, we could have planned it earlier. I agree, but we are where we are. So it's now about making sure that we get the best in use of land use and infrastructure together. As Kate has highlighted, the gross product of the area, once you have connections, goes up. We know that happens around the world. We know that's the case for an economic argument. Melbourne's recognized that it's missing the wheel for SRL. It's recognized that the way people travel is going to change. The public transport users will save about 40 minutes in some of the one-way trips going forward. But it's not about only the train and the transport mode. It's about the precincts around it and how we reshape those precincts going forward, and making sure that urban fringe becomes a problem in relation to infrastructure cost and delivery, and that becomes a problem globally. No matter what city in the world you go to, it's the same issue. At least the Suburban Rail Loop is trying to tackle some of those questions that we have in relation to the middle suburbs, and understanding that the land use needs to change around those precincts area.
I suspect that in 50 years' time, we'll be looking back and we'll be talking lovingly about the Suburban Rail Loop because of the changes that it's brought to the city. But one of the things I observed looking at all the different rail case studies that I'm deeply invested in for my PhD is that very oftentimes the business case and the procurement model didn't really stack up. So there's a gap between what the benefit cost ratio from a very simplistic view, what stacked up, and the kind of all the additional urban and social measures that don't necessarily make it into those older style business cases. You have to take a leap of faith with. And in 50 years' time, you'll be celebrated for the leap of faith that was taken. Today, we tend to look critically at the fact that we didn't already make that leap of faith. But I really feel concerned sometimes about the decisions we make in procuring projects and planning projects, that we very narrowly define the benefit. And in smaller cities with less intense transport usage, it's always really difficult to justify it against those metrics over such a short frame of time.
Can I just...
Sorry, Jago, go ahead.
Look, I'll just say, I don't want to get into a debate about the Suburban Rail Loop. I think one of the things we have failed to innovate in is in the way we manage auto mobility. I see in those policy reviews, one of the areas that is not getting a lot of attention is actually saying and fronting up to the fact that the automobile is causing problems in our cities, and we actually need to take more direct and active measures to address it, rather than just saying, well, people can choose how they travel in the city. Questions of road pricing, parking pricing, and so forth. We need to be really seriously thinking about those kind of issues, particularly as electric vehicles start to be adopted, which have lower operating costs than conventional vehicles. So if we're putting $50 billion into a suburban rail loop, we don't want to have it competed against by relatively cheap travel by automobile. We actually need to be starting to wind back automobility in the city in order to enable more active and sustainable modes of travel. So I think that's another area of innovation. We've been talking about road pricing for a long time and haven't really got very far in implementing it. Parking pricing is, well, we're not even really talking about parking pricing. Even changing our land use regulations to reduce the prominence of parking within them seems to be something that governments have no appetite to tackle in Australian cities. So there's a lot of innovations we could implement that are relatively easy. I'll say that perhaps a little flippantly, but that would support some of the other innovations we're trying to achieve in sustainable transport.
I think you make a really good point, actually, just from the holistic perspective of different forms of movement that we strategize for. And again, if I was conjuring a city out of thin air that does it particularly well, I'd look at Vienna and the intersection between their pedestrian movement strategies, their cycling movement strategies, where cars can't go rather than where cars can go, and what times cars can't go there. And even just the basics of timetabling integration between modes of transport at key nodes, down to being able to buy refreshment, including alcohol, at the stop where you catch the light rail. So, they've really thought about the experience, the service, the infrastructure in a very holistic and integrated way. And I guess that's the benefit of having had the same colour of government and incredible continuity of policy over a really extended period of time.
And Jago, I suppose round out both comments from Kate and Jago in relation to this. In the business investment case, Kate, and I'll talk about BCRs, it's one measure. And we should always look at it as just one measure. We should not look at it as the end measure. And in relation to this, because the social and the economic benefits are great across these types of projects. And in the business investment case, we talked about a car park levy introduction in 2035, Jago. So, we want to encourage people to use the public transport. We want to encourage people to not use their cars. So, we are starting to have those conversations. I know it's not as fast as people want to have the conversations, but we've put that out there in the business and investment case.
There is very much a comment in our question and answer portal about why we're playing catch up. Why can't we shift away from cars? Why? and directly to you, Frankie, why is the SRL project taking so long to be completed?
Well, first of all, I've got to go and procure and get a contractor on board, and I've got to build 26 kilometers and 6 new stations in SRLE. So, the time frame is about 14 years, which is about right in the infrastructure side of things. I wish I could do it faster, but I'd be working 24 hours, 7 days a week, which might upset some of the residents in there. So, making sure that we take into account, because it is a long time, but it's planning for the future. This is a plan for the future in relation to the middle suburbs, which is really, really important, and really important to get the precincts right. So when I came to SRL to start with, the start of the year, they were very happy to show me the tunnels design and then the train design. I said, well, what about the station design? Because that's the first thing you see. When you come to a community, that's the first thing you see.
I'd support that. And I think actually 14 years, whilst it seems like a long time, and sadly in 14 years I shall be 70, so that's a little bit concerning. What that longevity does give you is the opportunity to build a transport culture and a transport capability alongside the transport capacity. So whilst it's a long time, let's use it wisely.
Can you talk more about that I'm just writing notes here, transport culture and capability. Can you expand?
Yeah, sure, a little bit. So I think that one of the things that you see is quite often we build, so Australia has a growing, to be generous, transport culture. You go to other Northern European cities and you find, my daughter would never catch a bus or a train. She wouldn't even know how to, but I grew up, I didn't even have a car till I was 30. And I expected to be able to get on the underground or the main line or the bus or walk, God forbid. And I had a culture of taking public transport. It was just how you moved around the city, and you understood the city's geography and amenity in terms of what you could get to in how long. And you knew how to use, this line was quicker to go here, this route was better to go there, at 5 o'clock, never take that bus. You grew up with a culture of understanding what it would be like and which stops felt safer, felt more amenity friendly. And that's how I learned my cities, whichever city I was working in. And I think that we still have a lot of work to do to grow the idea that actually you take the train, the bus, the tram, the light rail first, and that your car is not the first thing that you get in, and that particularly for short trips, it should be left in the garage at all times or the parking lot. So I think that's really important. I think the other thing is around our transport capability, which goes back a little bit to what Jago was saying at the beginning, that we are really sitting in the doldrums of transport innovation, and we need to drag ourselves to today and propel ourselves into the future. And so this timeline that Frankie's got is like a golden gift, really, if we're able to start building that innovation capability, that, again, no pun intended, networked systems type thinking that helps us to make sure by the time we do go live, we've got people ready to use this, excited to use this, knowledgeable about how to use this and how to operate it, and then able to export that skill overseas as part of our economic gain from the project. That if we actually use the 14-year runway to do all of those things, then what you've achieved has real social impact.
And just I think it will possibly be a closing question to our wonderful panel. How has COVID shaped this transport culture? How has it shaped it, and how will it shape it? These habits that we've formed during COVID, how will they continue into the future?
I'm happy to take a first stab at that, if you like, whilst the gentlemen gather their thoughts. So it's really interesting when you look at the data about ridership in cities where there is an established transport culture. And so, yes, and also in cities where we have the automation of key intersection points for customers on a transport journey. So Singapore, London, Paris, yes, lower ridership, but not catastrophic. In those cities where ridership is a bit formative and the culture is not so strong and the innovation means we're still touching everything, we've seen a much greater drop off. So I would come back to the idea that this is not negotiable. Carbon and climate and densification and every other thing we know about being a future city, successful city in the future, demands and mandates that we're using a high capacity transport network. And so we can kick and stream or we can embrace it. But I think in Australia, it's had a nasty dip, and we've got to work really hard now to move up the transport as an experience continuum to encourage people.
I agree with Kate, but I also look at this as an opportunity. What the pandemic has shown us is in relation to, we want to live and work close together. We don't want to be commuting for hours upon hours. You know, suburban rail loop in a precinct sense gives the opportunity to do both of that. Live and work within a 20-minute neighborhood. Get your services, get your entertainment, get your arts, get everything you need within the 20-minute neighborhood. So I think this is a huge opportunity that people understand how this will work going forward. And to try and get the communities involved to actually make sure that we get it right going forward. So, you know, I really think this is a golden opportunity. You know, I look at this as, you know, we've learned so much from the pandemic. Let's not lose it. Let's make sure we use it wisely and we actually go to the future well.
Jago, you have the floor.
Yeah, look, I think it's an interesting moment. We've seen such a change in terms of commuting patterns arising from COVID. I think one of the big questions is how durable those will be, and sort of dynamic effects, such as if we return to high population growth, and we've seen New South Wales propose another doubling migration from the 2019 level to around 400,000 people a year, which will sort of start to bring us back to the trajectory we were on before COVID, which will help with the recovery for public transport. I think the question of how many people will continue to work at home versus commuting to an office every day or a few days a week is a really big question. But irrespective of that, it has given us an opportunity, as Frankie's indicated, to make the most of suburban-based activity. And I think we should be looking at ways of enhancing that kind of local living concept. I know Department of Environment in Victoria is putting a lot of emphasis on the 20-minute neighbourhood kind of concept at this point in time, and how to use the COVID experience to support that policy development. Obviously, that syncs well with the suburban rail loop agenda. I think that's where there's a lot of potential. I'm also quite concerned that we allow the automobile to grab the share of travel that's not being undertaken by public transport. I think, you know, that's our big challenge. Are we going to be a city of 9 million in 2056 that's still travelling 80% of its travel by automobile, or have we moved to other modes like public transport, walking, cycling, or telecommuting? I think those are some big questions we need to grapple with at this point in time.
Absolutely. It's time for us to wrap this session up, but at first I want to thank you all so very much for such a fabulous discussion. We could consume more time, absolutely. So Professor Jago Dodson, Frankie Carroll and Kate Meyrick, really lovely to meet you all today and to discuss this really important topic. So we'll conclude our session here and give you a very short break for our final session of the day. I urge you to return, as it's going to be a wonderful live presentation from our international speaker, Aziza Akmouche, Head of Cities at the OECD. So Dr. Tom Ailes will be back with you to host this session, which will commence at 4:40 p.m. So with this slight change to the start time, please return to the timeline and refresh your page to reveal the updated timeline. And we'll see you in that final session. Thank you again.